Welcome back to many of you. Welcome to many of you. Good to see some familiar faces and some new ones. I'm Lisa Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence, and you are here for the 10th episode of our Thought Leader Conversations. Yay! Double digits. Which is our monthly conversation with experts who are in fields that are adjacent and relevant to the mentoring world. It's our chance to have a conversation about their expertise, but also a chance for all of you joining to ask your questions as well. And for that, ask you to liberally use the chat feature. We'll be monitoring those and looking out for your questions throughout. It's never interrupting. Without further ado, I want to introduce our guest, Aaron Hurst. So excited to talk to Aaron today. Let me tell you a little bit about him before we dig in. Aaron Hurst is a prominent serial social entrepreneur. He is renowned for his expertise in the science of purpose and fulfillment in the workplace. As the CEO of Imperative, which is a successful venture-based startup, Aaron introduced innovative employee purpose profiling technology that has empowered countless individuals to identify and embrace their professional purpose. In 2020, he revamped the company by launching an enterprise peer coaching platform, fostering crucial connections and employee development in the evolving hybrid workplace. This platform, centered on meaningful conversations to enhance trust, is emerging as a pivotal tool for fostering inclusivity and dismantling barriers within organizations. Notably, Aaron also founded the Taproot Foundation in 2001, which revolutionized the pro bono service market in the US and beyond, and authored the best-selling book, The Purpose Economy, in 2014, which predicted the ascendancy of purpose as a key driver of economic progress and innovation. And that's one of the topics we'll talk about today. His extensive contributions to purpose-driven work have been featured in prestigious publications, and he continues to be a sought-after speaker at corporate events and conferences, embodying a legacy of impactful leadership and social change. Hi, Aaron. Welcome.
Hi, great to be here.
So
Excited for
glad.
the conversation.
Me too. Me too. Well, let's dig in, because I want to maybe start with just some grounding. Can you let us know, how did you end up working in this field?
Yeah, it's there's so many different sort of answers to that question, just from different angles. But I was actually at a retreat last year, and someone said, "Whatever it is that you want is what you need to give."
Mm.
That I really reflected on that. I think that's a lot of the work I've done. Is like I've been struggling with purpose my whole life. So naturally created the curiosity to try to understand what in God's name are we actually talking about? What is this from a scientific standpoint, et cetera? And a lot of that comes from me from my grandfather was an officer in the Navy during World War II and was one of the first officers in Hitler's bunk right when the war ended. He actually stole a piece of Hitler's stationery, which we still have in the family, which is very creepy and weird just to see that piece of paper.
Mm.
But he, coming out of that experience, made it his goal in life to prevent World War III. He saw like firsthand the damage of war, especially at that scale, and was like, I want to do whatever I can to prevent that. And his core insight was that it was the intersection of purpose and connection is what prevents conflict. And that what we need, if we truly want to decrease conflict in the world, is we need to find a way to connect people to purpose and connect people to each other through purpose. And he went on and created the Peace Corps for President Kennedy, and then ran the Aspen Institute for 25 years, which was, both of those were about purpose and connection. The Peace Corps is based on his insight that Americans, being tourists, don't actually understand anything about a culture. They actually need to be able to have a shared purpose experience with the local community to actually understand, and vice versa. And the Aspen Institute was really around, how do we get people from disparate backgrounds to talk about things that are of shared importance to them? So I grew up with that as sort of this looming large legacy. And as a result, like, it was really stressful, honestly. I mean, it's the equivalent of having like a really wealthy relative where it's like nothing you can do can compare. I felt like similarly, that legacy, while inspiring, was daunting, and it caused me to do a lot of work around what is purpose, what impact am I supposed to make, how does this all work? So that's a lot of like what brought me into this. I would also just share, my parents were hippies to like the 10th degree, living in a teepee outside of Aspen. We're part of the Tibetan Buddhist community, which we were deeply entrenched with throughout my entire childhood. So I grew up going to like Buddhist elementary school with my parents constantly going away for retreats. And really, like, a lot of the language around being present, the language around consciousness was part of what I grew up with. So I was really, I think, blessed to have my grandfather as a role model, but then also to have this this framework of this community that was, I think, focused on the right things in terms of how we need to show up in the world. So I could go on and on, but that's the mid-length answer.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so fascinating because we use this term purpose as if we necessarily know what it is,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Um, and I was just this morning, as I do fairly often, I got a call from I had a call with a young woman who found my name and booked some time and said, I'm kind of trying to figure out what it is I'm supposed to do.
Yep.
So how do you know it? Like, how do you define it, and how do you know that? How do you know it when you see it?
I think the first thing that I've seen, Lisa, you have to understand like the myths around it
Yeah,
because the myths are actually probably the top challenge we have in people actually sort of living with purpose
yeah,
because our culture has propagated these stories about purpose that are getting in our way. So maybe I can share a couple of those, Lisa, if that's
please.
helpful.
Yep.
So the first one, which I think is one of the most common, is that like purpose is a cause. People believe I need to find a cause, right?
Hmm.
I saw this all the time at the Taproot Foundation, where I had business execs who were like, I need like don't have any meaning in my job. Like I need to go find a cause so that I can, find meaning in my life and in my work. And on the occasions that they quit and then went and got a job at a nonprofit, they inevitably would call me 6 months later, being like, "This is the same thing. I'm just getting paid a lot less." Because they didn't realize that like it was not about the cause, that a cause is not what brings a sense of meaning to you, that in fact we have to create that meaning for ourselves. So that's the number one myth I would say is that. The second is, to your point, people feel like it's going to happen as a revelation,
Hmm.
that they're going to get struck by the proverbial lightning and it's going to sort of become clear to them what their purpose is, that God's going to like give them their tablet with their purpose etched on it, right? And it sounds far-fetched, but it's a core part of our culture, is this belief that somehow it's just going to emerge for you. One great example of that is a lot of people who go to graduate school, when you actually ask them, why did you go to graduate school? It's because they assume that their purpose would emerge through the experience of higher education,
Hmm.
which does not happen. So that's sort of an example of how, especially like higher education has marketed to people with the promise of a revelation, which is not actually something that they can deliver on.
Hmm.
Um, the other myth that is really common is the belief that we don't need to find meaning in our work. We can get that elsewhere. We can get it through religion. We can get it through family. We can get it through sports leagues, community, etc. What we found in our research and imperative of the people who said they were fulfilled in life, only 1% said they weren't fulfilled at work. Which is to say, basically, if you are working, if you're not fulfilled at work, the odds are you're not fulfilled, period, like full stop. So that is a really important piece because I think a lot of executives are like, this work doesn't have to be meaningful. That's not the job of work. And it's like, statistically, you're like what they call wrong about that. And
Yeah.
the final one I'll just share with you, Lisa, is people think it has to do with it's a luxury because people are all raised on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they're like, well, like for people who just really need a paycheck, like they don't care about purpose, they don't care about meaning, like they're like at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, and therefore, like that's where they need to focus. What we found is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs applies to people with a scarcity mindset, but there are a lot of people who have an abundance mindset, and for them, this is absolutely not that triangle just completely like falls apart. And I don't know how much international travel you've done or traveling around different economic zones in the US, but in my travels, I've consistently seen people who are barely like making it in terms of food and basic needs who have a high level of fulfillment in their lives. And I've worked with a lot of corporate executives making, millions of dollars a year who are like deeply unfulfilled. So we really have to let go of this idea that it's tied to some kind of income level or that's going to happen to us once we get a certain amount of money. And that's something that also can get weaponized so easily by leadership to not take responsibility for certain jobs needing to be meaningful because they're like, oh, those are just like bottom of the pyramid jobs. You're like, yeah, like, yes, they don't pay much. You're right about that. But that's not actually how this works. So those myths, among others, I think are really important for people to truly understand what's going on and to start to like free them up to realize purpose is something we create for ourselves. It's not something that's ever given to us.
Yeah. The question that popped in my head as you were talking
Yeah.
and is it discovered or is it grown? Right. And maybe
What's
the
the
answer
difference
is
between the
yes.
two?
Um, Or maybe is it discovered or is inherent? Is it something that you find externally, right? That,
Yeah.
like for you, this idea of purpose is something that came deeply from your upbringing because of what your family history is, and then you probably supplemented that along the way. The seed was there, right? But are you planting the seed? Are you watering the seed, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you certainly need to cultivate that within you.
Hmm.
Um, and I would say my family, I think, helped me build some of the skills to focus on it. I don't think they ever gave, they didn't set a purpose for me, and they created a belief that one should make an impact in the world and a belief that one should try to operate in a present and conscious way.
Yeah.
But in terms of like identifying like a purpose, yeah, it's a different path. And that's really tied to also like a lot of people talk about a calling.
Hmm.
And what a calling is purpose with a fixed mindset.
Say more about that.
So a fixed mindset is a belief that you are what you are, and like you only have one way of being, and you can't be other ways. You can't learn new things, can't operate differently. When people say like my calling is to be a doctor, what they're doing is they're trying to find something that has a purpose and meaning to it, but they're creating a fixed box it has to operate in, which then becomes highly problematic, especially like when they retire or if they want to shift, because they've tied it to something that's like a human created box for definition that doesn't enable them to have a growth mindset about all the different ways in which they could find meaning. And, I think certain jobs and certain paths may create more meaning for us than others, but it's so important to have a growth mindset towards purpose in the sense that you can create purpose for yourself anywhere.
Mm.
And a calling is really just this like regimented, boxed in way of thinking about purpose. And I think a lot of people look at that and it seems so desirable because it's clear, but it's actually a trap, I believe.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Let me just do some context for those who don't know the fixed growth mindset
Yeah.
paradigm, which comes from Carol Dweck's work on mindset. The idea that growth mindset is that you can expand, you can grow into things. We may not be good at something yet, but you can become. You may not know something yet, but you can become. Things are not fixed, right? And obviously the opposite here being fixed is people are the way they are. I have what I have. I'm going to be who I am, who I'm going to be. All those things. Really, really powerful framework that clearly applies here as well. So do you have a set definition then that you use on what purposes?
I try to not sort of get super set on the definition because then I think it becomes about semantics. I think
Hmm.
it's relative to a couple of other things, which is really around fulfillment
Hmm.
and meaning. And when I think about purpose are the things that you generally, it's easier for you to get meaning from.
Hmm.
And that when you operate, obviously, in alignment with that, you do get more meaning, which then creates a greater sense of fulfillment, because fulfillment's an actual feeling that's created through neurochemicals. And that gives you more confidence in your purpose, which then makes your work more meaningful, which makes you more fulfilled. So it creates this virtuous cycle that's neurochemically based, that begins with just sort of self-awareness around like what actually creates a sense of meaning for you in your life. And then it's often many different things that do that. And it's broadly defined that way. I think a lot of people
Ah.
look at it like a North Star,
Mm.
uh, and I think that definition can be helpful, but it's really easy for that to start to move into a cause-based definition or a calling-based definition. So try to really help people not get too anchored to specific language around it. I think it tends to become problematic.
Um, I had a thought. I had a question that it's gone, but it'll come back to me. It'll come back to me. Oh, this is the question I was going to ask. Um, can you have more than one purpose in your life, and can you have more than one purpose at once?
So the way I think about purpose is that over time you become better, you're able to see it better, and you're able, to your point, to like develop the skills and ability to manifest it
Hmm.
in the world. I haven't found anybody yet where I feel like it fundamentally changed. I
Hmm.
think what happened is you're just peeling back layers of the onion to get at a deeper and deeper truth of the why behind it and sort of what's at its essence. I think when people are bouncing around of like different purposes, it's more around like what different goals or different things that are motivating them or
Mm.
different causes that they're excited about. Or they're using like a very generic definition of purpose, which is just what is the intent? And you have different intents at different times in your life, sure. But that's, I don't think, nearly as meaningful because it doesn't get down to that deeper level.
Yeah. So what's a transactional mindset, and then what's the difference between that and purpose?
No, I love that you brought that up. So one of the things we did in our research with NYU, and which we then built on with other partners, was really looking at this as much more of the mindset, which I think is a much more helpful way of thinking about purpose than thinking about it as like a definition of my purpose is blah, 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 right? So a purpose mindset is a fundamental belief that life can be meaningful and that it's up to us to create that meaning.
Mm.
A transactional mindset is a fundamental belief that certain things are meaningful and other things aren't, and that it is an external body that is creating that meaning. And it's also a fundamental belief that ultimately everything is at its core a transaction, and that everything is ultimately like a what's the right way to that ultimately everything is there's a winner and a loser in everything. And what we found is that people have a transactional mindset, which is about 2/3 of America. They're not fulfilled. And the reason they're not fulfilled, they're much, much more likely to be unfulfilled, is that they don't believe they can be fulfilled. So guess what happens? Like they don't create a sense of fulfillment for themselves. People with a purpose mindset, just like a growth mindset, believe it's possible to be fulfilled, and they also see it as their responsibility. And shockingly, like the majority of them are fulfilled because they're actually creating that. So what we're seeing is like there's a real challenge in our society right now where most of our school system and most of organizations are telling the story of a transactional mindset, which is not in anyone's best interest. We saw it's not associated with good health outcomes, performance outcomes, et cetera. When we need to actually be instilling purpose mindset in our cultures and in our schools, so that the next generation truly has the tools and the belief that it's possible. And one last thing I'll just share, at least on this, which maybe makes it more concrete, is nothing is inherently meaningful. Nothing inherently has meaning. We as human beings create meaning for things.
Mm-hmm.
A rock is a rock unless you decide that that rock has a meaning behind it, right? So the act of actual meaning creation is reflection. It's actually the act of thinking about something, giving it meaning, and storing that in our minds as a meaningful thing. So if you have a purpose mindset, you're regularly reflecting and you're basically creating meaning out of things. Whereas a transactional mindset, you do the exact same thing, but you're not actually then creating meaning because you're not doing that reflection work that's necessary. And I think that's the other thing that we've seen in our society is we've gotten so busy and technology has so dominated our lives that we don't reflect. And then we report that our lives aren't meaningful and we blame our this or that, work, family, whatever it is. But the reality is like, if you don't make time to reflect, it doesn't matter what you do, it's not meaningful, like full stop.
Mm. I want to rewind about 40 seconds when you said
Please.
something about how that our schools encourage transactional mindset. What would be an
Yep.
example of a way that they do that?
I mean, the most obvious is grades.
Mm. Mm.
And another one would be like the standard core and like how you're teaching to a standard versus teaching to curiosity, teaching to how you show up as a fellow student, those things which actually matter. The Common Core, I think, set us back big time in terms of culture. I understand the motivation behind it. It was a good motivation, but I think when you look at the actual effect of it, it's been really detrimental. Same thing with, I think, the way we look at and talk about grades and getting into college. High school becomes just all about, for those that are on that track, how do I get the grades? How do I get into college? It's not about learning. It's not about curiosity most of the time. It's just, how do I achieve this college thing? Then you get to college and it's the same thing to get the job. And then you get to the job and then it's like, I need to make enough money to pay off my college debt. And then I've got a kid, et cetera, and just sort of continues down that path. So I think the Common Core and the way we do grades are at the core of the challenge in our school system.
Yeah. Before we move on to the connection to mentoring, which I want to delve
Yep.
into next, I'm curious how it was for you that you discovered that your purpose was about purpose. I mean, obviously there's some a lot there feeding that from your family. But when that light bulb come up for you?
I don't think it's, I mean, what I would say is I struggled with it and I just became curious and I started having insights about it that other people found valuable. And that encouraged me to continue to explore what is this and what is actually helpful and what matters. So that was really sort of what drove the connection to purpose as a topic.
Yeah.
When I was running Imperative, using our purpose profiling technology, was able to sort of identify what are the things that bring meaning to me. And it's largely around like challenging the status quo, building community, and doing that at a societal level. Like those are the things that generally give me goosebumps and get me fired up about doing it. And I poetically sort of shifted that into like, my purpose is to awaken lions so they can care for their pride.
Ooh.
This idea of like building courage so that we can actually take care of each other collectively. And I've more recently, actually, as of a much longer story, but sort of more recently really uncovered, like for me, purpose is really around caring for the female lineage of my family, is really what I've come to like understand. And that the lineage of my mother and my grandmother, like that I'm a vessel for helping continue that work in the world for them. And that really is where this purpose, and this is where connection, these things that matter to me come from. And that's brought a lot of clarity to me, just to sort of understand that from an ancestral standpoint of like, what is the work I need to do here on the planet?
Mm. Mm. Beautiful. Do you think that's preordained? I mean, do you think I mean, maybe this is more of a spiritual question than anything else, but I think that there is some spirituality to when you think about purpose anyway. Like, is there one purpose for each person, or do we have more of a, is there more fluidity in what that can be?
And what we saw in the research, which is not the spiritual answer, was really
Yeah.
there's surprisingly even distribution across cultures of different purpose preferences. So there's some kind of symmetry in nature around not precise purpose, but the sort of categorization of the different preferences around it, which to me speaks to there's some reason in nature that we have a diversity of purposes because that's necessary for as a society for us to survive. So I
Yeah.
think there's something like baked into the system that enables that, which one can say is in nature, you can say it's religion, whatever you want to sort of like
Yeah.
associate that with, but it
Yep.
was remarkable the symmetry that we saw there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really,
And very
really cool.
similar to like Jonathan Haidt's work on values, how like around the world, like the classically conservative and liberal population distribution is like shockingly similar when you get down to it at its core. Like there's something in society that also creates some kind of even balance in some of these forces to enable us to survive as a species, which super fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the intersection of your work on purpose and my work on mentoring, I think there is maybe self-evident, but I want to put a little bit of a pin
Yep.
on it and explore that, right? So an example is a call that I had this morning, a young person saying, I need a mentor to help me find my purpose right here. I don't know what it is I'm supposed to do. So who can I talk to who's going to help me find what it is that I want to do? And I guess leads to the first question, the first next question, which is what does one do to make their work more meaningful? How can we find meaning
Yep.
ourselves in the work that we do?
I think there's two components to that, Lisa. One is what we talked about before, is reflection.
Hmm.
So if nothing else, no matter how much you hate your job, if you just at the end of the day take a moment and say, like, what is one thing today that was meaningful? You'll find something and you'll create meaning out of that job. Conversely, if you have a great job that generally you think you love and you don't do that reflection, like your job still won't be meaningful at the end of the day. So you've got to make space for reflection to make it be meaningful, like full stop. Second piece is in the research we uncovered, there's three sources of fulfillment in our lives and in work. Meaningful relationships, making an impact that we perceive matters to someone else, and then growing. We call it RIG, relationships, impact, and growth. So if you're really thinking about what it is like you want to do to make your work more meaningful, don't focus on the calling, don't focus on some sort of external broad definition. Focus on each of these categories. So start with relationships. Do I have meaningful relationships at work? If not, why? If so, with whom? If not, maybe there's certain people you'd like to build a meaningful relationship with. If you're not investing in relationships at work, it doesn't matter what you're doing. Like ultimately, again, you will not be fulfilled. In terms of impact, it's, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis that is making a difference to someone other than yourself? Does not have to be climate change. It can be a very small thing, like I just make people laugh every day. But you need to have something that you perceive. It doesn't even actually have to be true, Lisa, but you have to perceive that you've done something that matters to somebody else to feel fulfilled. So one of the things that's great as a mentor is just to ask questions around what did you do today that you felt like made a difference to someone else? When was the last time you felt like you really made an impact that mattered to someone else at work? Maybe encouraging someone to journal for a month, one thing every day that they felt like mattered to somebody else, and look at the pattern. What kind of things were you doing that actually created that? And the final one, relationships, impact, and then growth. So if we have great relationships, we're making an impact, that works for a while. But if we're not growing, we also sort of hit a wall. And growing is not usually about sort of learning in the classic sense of it. It's really about pushing yourself and actually stretching yourself beyond your comfort zone is where the real growth goes. So I think as a mentor, exploring like, where do you feel like you have fears that are holding you back? What are some things that, like, if you had just a little more courage, you would try, and then try to get them to take that step, for them to realize like growth is not given to you by your manager. It's something you have to create. And it's not about a class. Usually it's not about a book. So those three areas of relationships, impact, and growth multiplied by reflection is the magic formula.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's really brilliant. It's it speaks to something that we say over and over again, which is that the mentor's job is not to give answers, right? The mentor's job
Oh,
really is to ask questions, to stoke that curiosity, to encourage the reflection. And those questions that you offered are really brilliant. I love that.
no, and the advice thing I couldn't agree with more. And I think that's something, especially as a white male, it took me a little while to learn, like, that advice is generally not helpful.
Mm,
Sharing experiences and asking questions is helpful.
yep.
But I realized, I mean, the research shows people giving advice helps the person giving it way more than the person receiving it. And it's a
Hmm.
selfish act. And I think for people to start to realize that, starts to shift your mindset around that as well.
Yeah. I always say, like, if you find yourself tempted to share your experiences and give your advice, which sometimes is what's asked of you, always
Mhm.
end it with a question. And how does that
Yep.
land for you? Or
Yep.
how might that be different for you? Really,
Yep.
really. Um, how can a mentor help a mentee develop this purpose mindset?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, Lisa, to what we just talked about. I think if you're doing that regular reflection, you see how you can create a sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And you're starting to make little hacks to your job, to your relationships, impact, and growth. Within a week alone, you'll see a change in an individual, not like a titanic change, but like a little change. And they'll start to build that belief that it's possible and that it's not something that's going to be given to them. They're the one that needs to create it.
Hmm.
And it's through that act of continuous experimentation with meaning that they're
Hmm.
actually going to get to sort of that shift in mindset. I think the other piece is for them to just identify, like, what are all the transactional mindset beliefs that you have right now, and to really own those, because they'll continue to get in your way. So, if it's a belief in I need to make X amount of money to be able to be successful, it's like, why? What is behind that motivation? Maybe that's true, but like, what's the why behind it? I need to, be more successful than my brother. Okay, maybe, like, why? Like, what's behind that? Only certain professions are respected. Okay, maybe, like, what's behind that? Like, being able to name all these things
Yeah.
that are these constructs that actually push us back into transactional, because they're ultimately fear-based, is super helpful for folks.
Yeah. I'm laughing a little bit because I'm
Uh,
thinking about an example. No, in a good way. Um, Thinking
mhm.
about, often I'll present to groups of engineers and,
Yep.
I can almost hear the like terror in their minds as they're hearing you say this. Like, what do you mean we have to move from the head to the heart? And as we're, having these conversations. And I'm wondering, towards that end, what sort of resistance you find to this idea and how to overcome that for somebody who is just not inclined to do that kind of reflection. Obviously, I'm overgeneralizing. There's plenty of
Yeah,
engineers who are too, but you get the
I think
idea.
there's a couple of things. I think most people are open to it. They just don't, like, they know intuitively it's the right thing. They just
Hmm.
don't have the muscle and the process to do it, and they don't have a safe place to do it.
Mm,
So if you sort of start with that, like, there's probably 10% of people who just like are like too far gone, frankly. But I
mm,
believe the vast majority of people, like, they know it intuitively. They just don't have the safety and the tools and the practice to do it.
yep.
So I think that's just starting with that recognition makes a huge
Yeah.
difference, right? The next thing I would say is, like, speak their language. So if you heard me talking earlier about reflection, relationships, impact, and growth, and constantly experimenting, what you're basically doing is treating yourself like a piece of software.
Mm,
where you don't wait to do like the major release until everything is perfect. You continuously do little releases to experiment and see what's working and what's not working to be able to create ultimately the right technology, right? I'm doing that right now. I'm building an app and like it's constantly throwing stuff out and trying new things, et cetera. So if you can create it, the parallel to basically you are software, you're developing yourself, and there isn't like a specific like final version. It's a constant iterative process, and it only happens through experimentation. And that's a framework that they can get their heads around because it's how they work themselves.
That's genius. Love that. I love that. Well, I have a couple more questions for you. Before I just want to take a pause for a second and encourage the folks who are joining us live, if you have questions, to put those in the chat because we'll have some time for that as well. So you wrote the book Purpose Economy. I want to just do a little bit of a quick plug for that because it's a great book, and I think give people an opportunity to take a look at what the cover looks like.
Ooh, that's nice.
And
Nicely merchandised.
that would be Michelle,
Thank
who
you,
did the
Michelle.
nice merchandising. But make sure to grab a copy on that. But it's been about 10 years, Aaron, since you wrote that. So
Yeah.
what have you seen since then? What's next for you on the frontier when you think about this work?
Yeah. No, when I wrote it in 2014, I was coming out of Taproot Foundation, where I was really working globally with nonprofit sector, corporations, governments, and really saw that there was this incredible quest for people to find meaning in their work. And that's why so many people were volunteering. That's why we saw so many people sort of questioning like what they wanted to do with their work. And a lot of that came out of sort of a follow-on from honestly 9/11, where there was this big shakeup and people thinking about like, what am I actually doing? What actually matters?
Mhm.
And there was also just a lot of changes in science. There was changes in the workplace, changes in the power structure. What's been interesting is we've had a couple of different things that have influenced the evolutionists. I think overall, it's proven very prescient in terms of what we've seen in terms of how the labor market has changed, how we've seen the products that are in the market have changed, how people are, in many cases, like having much more autonomy and ability to shape their path. Not everyone, so I want to be very clear about that. I think some of the things I think were really interesting. One was just the rise of MAGA and the Trump movement. At first, to me, I was like, well, maybe I got this all wrong because how could how does this align? But then I realized actually that too is a quest for purpose and for meaning and for a sense that you belong and you have something you need to do in the world that matters. And that the lack of that actually is a large part of what led people to look for that as a solution. So I started to see that actually as a manifestation of purpose itself. People wanted relevance, they wanted purpose. And then I think with COVID, we really saw such an awakening around understanding mental health and understanding that actually people are human beings. And that I think just further accelerated this overall trend in companies. I think we've seen some setbacks along the way. And I think that's the nature of anything, right? Where you sort of 2 steps forward, one back, 2 steps forward, one back. But I think as we become more and more clear that we are, human beings, that we are animals, that we have biological imperatives for how we operate, and we stop trying to think that we are robots. We're continuing to have to adjust what we sell and the labor market based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about and that we can learn from?
Yeah, I'm doing a portfolio right now. So I left Imperative about a year ago, and Imperative's continuing to do great work. I decided for this next stage, I really wanted to experiment with a bunch of different projects. So I'm working with Alma Brands down in Santiago, Chile, to create a purpose-driven leadership program for companies in Latin America. And that's been really fun, just working with the amazing team there and being able to use what I've learned, but bring it to a new audience. So that's been a lot of fun. Been working on a social venture called board.dev, which is recognizing that in the nonprofit sector, these organizations are heavily held back because of their lack of investment in technology. But the lack of investment is largely due to the fact that they don't have senior technologists involved in their decision making. So we're working to create a pipeline of thousands of tech leaders to place them onto nonprofit boards so that they can really help the organization navigate the path of technology and investment in it. So we've got some great companies, CDW, ServiceNow, Okta, Morgan Stanley, in the first few months already signed up, wanting to bring their tech leaders into nonprofits because they see it as such a great developmental effort. I'm working with another friend on a app using AI that enables people to convert traditional stories into ones in which white people are not the lead characters. So like enables you to suddenly make Cinderella black, or to make Goldilocks a Latina, and then like play that out through the stories. So it helps parents create representative stories for their kids, and also enables kids to write their own stories based on their culture and what their curiosity is. So just really powerful to see what AI can do there. I've started also a retreat and online learning platform. It's around shared purpose and helping people connect and support each other around purpose. And then finally, I'm doing some work, which I mentioned, I think, before our webinar today, Lisa, around how do we address, especially in our cities, the lack of connection. We're experimenting in Seattle with this idea of the Seattle Chamber of Connection, that there should be civic infrastructure parallel to a chamber of commerce, but that's focused on helping sort of measure, advocate for, and advance efforts to build human capital and social capital inside a city. So early days there, we're working on this idea of how can you onboard new people to a city? Because people, when they first move to Seattle, are generally not welcomed. And we realized like we can fix that if we could create parallel to onboarding at a company, like a city onboarding program. So we're early days trying to figure out, is that viable? What does that look like? So those are sort of my 5 projects right now. Having a great time, working too much, but having a good time.
So exciting. So exciting. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on how AI will either enhance or detract our ability to discover and live our purpose.
I don't know. It's such a complicated topic. I would
Yeah.
say what I am finding is just like when I watch too much Netflix, I start to sort of my intelligence starts to go down. I feel like I don't know if you experience that as well.
Yeah.
And my ability to articulate, to be able to like engage with people goes down the more Netflix I watch, which is not picking on Netflix. Any
Any of
form
the
of
streaming
streaming.
platforms. Yes. Yeah.
I'm complimenting them by making them like the Kleenex. It's like the
Yep.
universal name for streaming.
Yep.
What I'm finding as I use ChatGPT like a lot now is ChatGPT is having a similar impact on my ability to write,
Mm,
because it's so much easier just to go to ChatGPT, give it the outline, and like it writes something that is typically at a minimum good enough, but often, faster and better than what I would have produced in that, the amount of time I had. But as it's doing that, like the ability to recall words when I want them, the ability to like really structure my thoughts effectively, I find is starting to diminish with that. So I worry a little bit about like AI in many ways sort of is dumbing us down, or at least it's
mm,
dumbing me down in a lot of ways. On
mm.
the other hand, I am finding that with it, I'm able to be much more of a creative director, which I feel like is where I shine. And that AI is like implementing my creative direction, and it's allowing me to do creative direction in a way that I never could before, because I can do it at such a quick speed, and it's with such quality that I can just iterate on things so quickly. So that's my personal experience with it. I don't know, like broader society, I think it will in a lot of ways dumb us down,
Mm.
because
Yeah.
it's taking a lot of the creative cognitive work that we do. And then when you stop doing that and outsource that, your brain actually stops being able to do that as well. So
Yeah.
I am very worried about that.
From a connection point too, right? I mean, a lot of the times the iteration of ideas happens
Yeah.
in interpersonal
Yeah. I mean,
engagement.
I have some of my best conversations are in Chat GPT for sure. When I'm like trying to think through something, like I find it to be a
Yeah.
better thinking partner most of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so like instead of reaching out to someone and say, I want to talk through something, I just am able to use Chat GPT, and that, is amazing and awful. So totally agree.
Yes. Yes. I don't see any questions in the chat, but I want to just invite the folks who are joining us. You can unmute yourself if you have a question for Aaron. I'm sure the wheels are turning as they are with me with lots of questions. So, Jaisha, I saw you unmuted yourself. Hello, do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question for Aaron or for anyone. I'm also, in addition, I'm leading the development of a pilot mentoring program. So this is a very timely conversation, but I'm also teaching a dual enrollment course for ninth and 10th graders on career development. And I've been grappling with how to have this conversation around, that quest for purpose, and how do I bring that conversation to the 9th, 10th grade younger learners so that they can start thinking about that and germinating that concept into them. So, you have any ideas? Since there are future leaders, I'm like, how
Yeah.
do you just start having that conversation around purpose for folks at the 9th and 10th grade level?
I love that you're doing that. That is so awesome. And feel free to reach out if you want to like talk about it
Okay,
more
I definitely will. Thank you,
specifically.
Aaron.
I think it's very similar. Like I've worked with some educators, and when they talk about purpose, kids generally like don't engage with it very well. It's too broad, it's too overwhelming, it's not an effective communication. If it's more about like finding out what makes you happy, what makes you fulfilled, and like figuring out how you tick, so you can make decisions in the future about what you want to do that are actually based on who you are, not what other people want you to be, right? That frame is much more effective. And then you can use the same, like if I were to teach that class starting today, not knowing anything else, at the core of it, having kids journal on relationships, impact, and growth, and to do so privately so they feel like it's safe. But to every day say like, what's one relationship, what's one impact, what's one way I grew, and then have them at the end of the trimester or whatever the semester, whatever the timeline is, sort of have to write a paper on what are the patterns and trends that you see across those journals, and what does that tell you about how you, what kind of decisions and what kind of direction you should go in your life. I think would lead to like some really remarkable insights. The other thing I would consider is having them do informational interviews with people out in the world, but have them ask about relationships, impact, and growth. What are the relationships that are meaningful for you at work? When do you feel like you're making an impact? How and what ways do you feel like you're growing? That's much more meaningful than just being like, what's it like to be a police officer? You know, like that's generally, you know, interesting, but not nearly the same.
That's a great idea. Yeah. So that was one of the assignments. I was having an informational interview, but I really like that framing of the relationships, impact, and growth. So
this makes it human.
you. And I'll definitely reach out to you, and I'm interested in definitely ordering that book as well. So thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts really that are just rolling around in your head? What ideas has this spurred in you? What curiosity has this spurred?
Or anything you disagree with, I'd be curious to hear as well.
Anything you disagree with?
I'll go.
Okay.
These are the swirling ideas, and I was taking notes as Aaron was talking because I could type faster than I can write because I can see the ability to use your relationship impact growth questions. I'm a corporate mentor.
Yep.
And to Jace's point, I'm growing the program right now, and I'm bringing in other mentors, and it's kind of an overwhelming task, but I like thinking about things in the terms that you're talking about. And I remember a book a while ago called The Purpose-Driven Life.
Yep.
That was really a big one. And that's where things started having an impact on my thought processes on, well, what is the purpose? And then and so something you said, Lisa, you know, we're not directing our mentees, do this, do that, do this, do that, but getting them to think. And that's what you just did, Aaron. It was a really great presentation because that's what this just did for me. So I can relay this now back to them. And I think a lot of it comes from you having hippie parents, which I'm old, so I love that, okay? I can see it. I can see it. Thank you so much.
It's such a gift. And I love that you're doing that. And let me know, like, curious to hear how it goes. I think it's a great way. Just that simple framework is so valuable for helping the mentee because you got questions and they're just helping them reflect and create their meaning. But also I think it decreases like when people are like, asked to be a mentor, a lot of times you're just like, like I don't even know like what it means to be a mentor or like what's involved. But if we can train people to say it's not about you having any answers, it's just about having a relatable person who can ask about relationships, impact, and growth, and can maybe share some of their own stories around that. Like, oh, like that seems like suddenly like a much more attractive and viable role. So I just think from a recruiting and training of mentors, it's also a helpful framework.
100%. I love that framework. I love that framework. Also, I really helps spur the growth for the mentor as well, the learning as well. Okay. Haley says she's curious about the distinction between mentoring and coaching. I can take that one quickly, Aaron, and then I'm curious your thoughts as well. So they are they are sisters, and there is a lot of overlap. I like to say that all good mentors are coaches, but not all coaches are mentors. Coaching is a skill that mentors use. It is what is missing in coaching that you have in mentoring is this element of reciprocity and the element of co-creation. right? So mentoring is about learning, co-creation, and reciprocity. You have the learning and the coaching, but you don't have the reciprocity. It's not the coaching relationship is not a relationship that's designed for the development of the coach. And typically depends on the way the coaching is delivered, but typically the coach and the coachee do not co-create the relationship, whereas a mentor and a mentee co-create the terms of that relationship. So that's my answer. Aaron, do you have a different answer from your perspective?
You work on this field every day. I think when I was doing the work at Imperative, we were creating pure coaching, which was reciprocity driven. We used the word coaching, could have been mentoring. I think we were trying to elevate it so that people wanted to do it, but it was actually the AI that was generating the questions to ask each other. So in some ways, that changes the definition. But I think you're absolutely right. Coaching is a skill, mentor is more of a role. And I think there is more likely to be reciprocity. You certainly hear from mentors all the time how much they learn. And you don't hear coaches talk about that a little bit, but not nearly as much.
Yeah, there's a lot of data. I mean, it's not just anecdotal. There's a lot of data on how mentors develop as leaders, as professionals. They have much more career satisfaction, sense of engagement, probably because this idea of relationship, right? And impact, and weight and
growth.
So there you go,
series.
right? But I had not made that connection before, but there you go. I think that's where it all comes
I think it is. I think it's right on. It's also one of the things I like about relationships impacting growth is just that it's super simple and like a 5-year-old gets it. And I think a lot of things, like if they aren't something a 5-year-old would get, you should question whether or not they're real.
Yeah.
And with mentors, I think what's interesting, if you think about like a village, a billion, whatever, a million years ago, 100, whatever the right timeline is, a long time ago, like mentoring is part of human nature. Like you've got to believe that was happening in a village of 30 people a bazillion years ago, right? It's the way we're wired to operate. And we've tried to create all these man-made structures and systems that have moved away from that. But to me, it's returning to truth of how we're supposed to operate.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. All right, well, let me just share how folks can get in touch with you and what's coming up here as well. It's not to preclude any more questions if there are. Would love to see those as well. So here's how to get in touch with Aaron, another link to get his book. Our next thought leader conversation is on April 9th with Dr. Bev Kay. Some of you may recognize her from our National Mentoring Month conversation and also her many books on engagement and retention. So that will be another fun conversation as well. So I hope that you will join us then. Aaron, any final thoughts? Anything else that is coming up for you that you want to share with this crew?
April 9th is my 50th birthday. I want to share that fact.
Ah,
I think you're doing a webinar that day, sort of spreading the love. I love it. But no, I'd love to hear from folks. And LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that. So I'm on LinkedIn more times a day than I would like to confess, and sort of easy to interact back and forth there with any questions or thoughts. Would love that.
wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Aaron. I have so many takeaways. I'm looking forward to watching this through again, just so that I can capture all of those. But what
well said.
really looking forward to reading the book and digging in even further. Thank you to everybody who joined today, and have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your month. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Lisa.